My name is Mia Calloway. I'm 30 years old, and I've been married to my husband for 5 years. Last month, our family gathered at our home to celebrate my mother-in-law's 60th birthday. It was supposed to be one of the warmest nights of the year. But halfway through the evening, my sister-in-law stood up in the middle of the living room and announced to every single person there that I had been secretly manipulating my husband into cutting his entire family out of his mother's will. She said she had the messages to prove it. Within 60 seconds, the room went quiet in a way that made my chest hurt. My husband's relatives stared at me. Some of them looked shocked. Some of them looked like they had suspected something like this for a long time. My husband stood beside me with his jaw tight and his eyes searching my face for an answer. But I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I didn't even raise my voice. Because the truth was, I had been waiting for something like this for weeks, and I was more ready than my sister-in-law ever imagined. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Heartway Stories, and drop a comment letting me know what country you're watching from. Now let me take you back to the night everything came out into the open. We had been planning my mother-in-law's 60th birthday for almost 2 months. She is the kind of woman who never asks for anything, who spends her whole life giving quietly and never makes a sound about what she needs. So when she mentioned once in passing that she had always wanted a real family gathering for a milestone birthday, the kind with everyone under one roof and a long table full of food, my husband and I immediately decided to make it happen. We decorated our home with soft gold lights, filled every table with flowers she loved, and spent 2 full days cooking everything she had ever mentioned enjoying. By the time guests began arriving that evening, the house felt alive in the best possible way. People were laughing, her old friends were taking pictures, the children were running through the hallway, and my mother-in-law sat in the center of it all looking happier than I had seen her in years. My husband was smiling the whole night. He kept squeezing my hand when he walked past me, whispering that everything looked perfect. And it did. From the outside, everything was exactly what we had hoped for. But I had noticed something the moment my sister-in-law walked through the door. She arrived about 40 minutes into the evening, wearing a smile that looked practiced. She hugged her mother a little too tightly and a little too long, the way someone does when they are performing affection rather than feeling it. Then she walked into the kitchen where I was arranging desserts, and she looked at everything I had prepared, and she said, "You really went all out, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. It wasn't a compliment either. It was the same tone she had been using with me for years, the kind of thing that sounds polite in front of other people but lands differently when you know someone well enough to hear what they actually mean. My sister-in-law and I had never been enemies. We had never fought openly, never exchanged harsh words in front of the family. But from the very beginning of my relationship with my husband, she had made certain things clear in small, consistent ways. She questioned my background. She reminded people in casual conversation that I hadn't grown up with much money. She made jokes about how quickly my husband and I had moved in together, how young I had been when we met, and how little I had known about his family's expectations. None of it was ever said loudly enough to confront directly, but it accumulated over time into something I couldn't ignore. My husband knew some of it. He had spoken to her twice over the years, and both times she had apologized and things had been fine for a few months before slowly returning to the same pattern. I had learned to let most of it go. I was not going to spend my marriage at war with my husband's sister. It wasn't worth it, and more importantly, it wasn't who I wanted to be. But that night, something about her felt sharper than usual. She hovered near conversations she hadn't been invited into. She whispered to her husband near the back hallway in a way that made him glance at me twice. And at one point, when my mother-in-law was telling a story about the early years of raising her children, my sister-in-law interrupted her with a small laugh and said, "Well, things are different now that the family has grown." She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. My husband must have felt my tension because he found me near the kitchen around an hour in and asked quietly if everything was okay. I told him I was fine. I told him to enjoy the night. And I meant it because the truth was, despite everything I was picking up on, I was trying my best to stay present for his mother. This was her night, and I was not going to let anything take that away from her. We gathered everyone into the living room just before 9 o'clock to sing and cut the birthday cake. My mother-in-law sat in the armchair at the center of the room, looking genuinely moved, her eyes bright, her hands folded in her lap. My husband stood beside her with his arm around her shoulder. I stood nearby, holding the cake, while someone adjusted the candles. The whole room was warm and full, and it felt, for just a moment, like one of those evenings that stays with a family for years afterward. We had just finished singing when my sister-in-law spoke. "Before we cut the cake," she said, "I think there's something everyone here deserves to know." The room shifted. People turned toward her slowly. My husband frowned. His mother looked confused. My sister-in-law stepped forward into the center of the room, and she was holding her phone. "I've been quiet about this for a long time," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were moving across the room like she was making sure everyone was watching. "I've stayed quiet because I didn't want to upset anyone. But I can't keep doing that. Not when it affects this whole family." My husband said her name with a warning in his voice. She ignored it. "I have messages," she said. Then she looked directly at me. Messages that show exactly what's been going on behind our backs. She turned the phone toward the nearest group of relatives. Several of them leaned in to look. I could see from across the room that the screen showed a text conversation. My name was at the top. The messages appeared to be between me and my husband, and based on the expressions on the faces of the people reading them, what they showed was not good. One of my husband's aunts pressed her hand to her mouth. His older cousin looked up from the phone and stared at me. My mother-in-law's face had gone still in a way that scared me more than any words could. My sister-in-law continued talking. She said that for the past several months, I'd been pushing my husband to have his mother's will updated in a way that would reduce what the rest of the family received. She said the messages showed me calling her and her husband a drain, saying that my mother-in-law's estate should go primarily to my husband and therefore to me, and that the sooner the family understood that, the better. She said she had been sitting on these messages for weeks because she hadn't wanted to believe it, but that after what she had learned recently, she felt she had no choice. The room erupted. Not loudly. Not with shouting. It was worse than that. It was the sound of a room full of people drawing in breath at the same time and then going very, very quiet. The kind of quiet where everyone is thinking, but no one knows what to say first. My husband turned toward me. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were asking a question he didn't want to ask out loud. Several relatives were looking between me and my sister-in-law. One of his uncles crossed his arms. His cousin whispered something to her husband. My mother-in-law was still sitting in the armchair, and she looked not angry but deeply, quietly sad, which was somehow the hardest thing to see. My sister-in-law stood in the center of the room looking relieved, like she had been carrying something very heavy and had finally set it down. I took a slow breath. I did not look upset. I did not look panicked. And I know that probably confused some people in that room, because when a person is innocent and someone accuses them publicly like that, most people expect tears or anger or desperate explanations. What they don't expect is a woman who sets the cake plate down gently on the table beside her, straightens her back, and says quietly, "Can I ask you something?" My sister-in-law blinked. "What?" "Those messages," I said. "When did you get them?" She seemed caught off guard by the question. "A few weeks ago. Someone sent them to me." "Someone," I repeated. "Yes." I nodded slowly. "And did you check where they came from?" She frowned. "What do you mean where they came from?" "They came from your phone." I looked at my husband. His eyes were on me now, fully, waiting. "Could you send those screenshots to my husband's phone right now?" I asked her. She hesitated. "Why?" "Because I'd like to look at them closely. On a bigger screen." She glanced around the room as though she was trying to read the mood. A few people looked curious. She must have decided that agreeing made her look more credible, because after a moment she shrugged and said, "Fine." She tapped at her phone, and a second later my husband's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, looked at the screen. His jaw was still tight as he handed it to me. I looked at the messages. I took my time. Then I looked up and said, "These aren't real." The room stirred again. My sister-in-law's voice came back fast. "Excuse me? These messages," I said, keeping my voice even. "I never sent them." She laughed, but it had a brittle edge. "Of course you'd say that." "I would," I said. "But it's not just something I'm saying. I looked at her carefully. 3 weeks ago, I received a notification on my phone. A security alert from my messaging app. It told me that someone had tried to access my account from an unrecognized device. Silence. I didn't think much of it at the time, I continued. I changed my password and I moved on. But then, about a week later, a friend who works in digital security asked me if anything strange had happened with my accounts recently. I mentioned the alert. He offered to take a look. I paused. I let him. My sister-in-law's expression had shifted. The relief that had been on her face a few minutes ago was gone. What he found, I said, was that someone had not just tried to access my account. They had gotten in. For about 11 minutes, someone was inside my messaging app. And during those 11 minutes, a small number of message screenshots were captured. I let that settle in the room for a moment. 11 minutes is also about how long it would take to set up a fake conversation and photograph it to look like a real exchange. My husband was completely still. The security report, I continued, identified the device that had accessed my account. I looked directly at my sister-in-law. It was a tablet registered under your name. The room went electric. Several people started speaking at once. Someone said, "Wait, what?" Another voice said, "That can't be right." My husband's uncle unfolded his arms and leaned forward. My mother-in-law had both hands pressed flat against her knees. My sister-in-law's face had gone pale, but she rallied quickly. Her voice rose, and she said, "That's insane. I don't know anything about hacking into anyone's phone. You're making this up to cover yourself." "I'm not," I said. "And I can show everyone exactly what I mean." I walked to the corner of the room where my bag was sitting on the small bench near the door. I unzipped the front pocket and took out a folded printed document. I had put it there that morning before guests arrived. I had hoped I wouldn't need it, but some part of me had known I might. I unfolded it and held it up. "This is the security report my friend prepared," I said. "It shows the date, the time, the duration of the unauthorized access, and the registered owner of the device that performed it." I turned to face the room. "If anyone wants to come look at this, please do." My husband's cousin was the first to step forward. She read it for a moment, then looked up at my sister-in-law with an expression I had never seen on her face before. My husband walked toward me slowly. He took the paper from my hands and read it himself. His breathing was steady, but I could see the line of his shoulders tighten as his eyes moved across the page. When he finished, he looked up at his sister. He didn't yell. He spoke quietly, and somehow that was worse. "Your tablet," he said. She shook her head. Her voice came out thinner now. "I lend that thing to everyone. My husband uses it. My kids use it. It could have been anybody. For 11 minutes, he said, someone used your tablet to get into my wife's phone. And somehow, a week later, you show up here with fake screenshots of conversations she never had." "They're not fake," she said, but the certainty was gone from her voice. "Then explain the report." She didn't answer. The room had gone completely still. My mother-in-law was looking at her daughter with an expression that I think broke something open in the whole evening, because everyone in that room loved her. And watching her sit there with that look on her face made the weight of what was happening land differently on everyone at once. I had not planned to say what I said next. I want to be honest about that. When I had found the security report and understood what it meant, I had told myself that exposing the truth about the fake messages would be enough. I had told myself that was all I needed. But standing in that room, watching my sister-in-law look for an exit from a situation she had built entirely around deception, something else came up that I had to address. Because the fake messages weren't the only thing I had found. "There's something else," I said quietly. My sister-in-law's eyes snapped to me. My husband turned back toward me. "What do you mean?" I took a breath. When my friend was reviewing the security breach on my accounts, he noticed something else while he was checking the shared family documents folder. "The one your mother set up 2 years ago so the whole family could access important paperwork." Several people in the room looked at each other. Most of them knew about the folder. It had been my mother-in-law's idea after a health scare 2 years ago, a way to make sure that her medical paperwork, insurance documents, and the joint savings account she maintained for family emergencies were accessible to people she trusted if she ever needed help quickly. "She asked me to be one of the people with access," I said, "because I'm the one who takes her to most of her appointments." I looked at my mother-in-law gently. You remember setting that up? She nodded slowly. While my friend was in the system, he noticed that the joint savings account linked to that folder had seen a significant amount of activity over the past 14 months. I stopped. Activity that didn't match any medical expense I had ever helped coordinate. The room was absolutely silent. I reached back into my bag and pulled out a second document. This one I had printed on Saturday night, sitting alone at the kitchen table after my husband had gone to sleep, feeling sick to my stomach at what I was looking at. This is a summary of the transactions, I said. 41 withdrawals over 14 months. The total amount removed from that account is $63,000. I heard someone exhale sharply. My husband's aunt said something under her breath in a voice I couldn't make out. My mother-in-law pressed her hand over her mouth. My husband turned to look at his sister. She was standing very still. The color in her face had changed completely. She looked like a person who had walked into a building expecting to find one room and had fallen through the floor into a much deeper place. Each withdrawal, I said carefully, was transferred to a separate account. The account belongs to a business entity registered 8 months ago. The business is registered under a name that isn't yours. I paused. But the address on the registration is your home address. I heard my husband's uncle say something sharp and short. My husband's voice, when he spoke, was the quietest I had ever heard it. How much did you say? $63,000, I said. Over 14 months. My mother-in-law's eyes had filled. She wasn't looking at anyone. She was just looking down at her hands in her lap. My sister-in-law finally found her voice. It came out jagged and high and desperate, the way voices sound when a person has run completely out of ground to stand on. You don't understand, she said. That money was going towards something for the family. I was going to pay it back. I was handling something that nobody else was dealing with. $63,000, my husband said again. Not a question. Just the number, repeated. She turned toward him with her eyes wide and her hands raised slightly. Kevin, I need you to let me explain. I know how this looks, but it isn't. It isn't what? He said. What isn't it? She didn't finish the sentence. My mother-in-law stood up slowly from her armchair. She did it the way she does everything, with a kind of measured, unhurried dignity that makes you understand immediately that whatever comes next will be said with full intention. She looked at her daughter for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but there was something behind it that I had never heard from her before. You told me last year that I didn't need to keep watching that account so closely, she said. You told me you would manage it for me while I was getting treatments. My sister-in-law opened her mouth. I trusted you, her mother said. That was all. Just those 3 words, delivered without anger, which somehow carried more weight than any anger could have. The room was silent for a long time. Eventually, my husband's cousin gently put her arm around my mother-in-law and guided her back to her seat. Several conversations started at once in low, tense voices. My husband's uncle was on his phone in the corner. My husband stood in the center of the room, looking at the floor with his hands pressed together in front of his mouth, the way he does when he is processing something and doesn't trust himself to speak yet. My sister-in-law had stopped talking. She stood near the far wall with her arms crossed over herself, not meeting anyone's eyes. Her husband had come to stand beside her, but he wasn't saying anything either. I went to my mother-in-law. I sat on the arm of her chair and put my hand over hers, and she squeezed my fingers without looking up, and I just stayed there. After a while, my husband came and crouched down in front of his mother. He took both of her hands in his and stayed there quietly for a moment before looking at her and saying, I'm so sorry. I didn't see it. She shook her head slowly. Neither did I. My husband stood and looked across the room at his sister. He was not the kind of person who raised his voice, and he didn't then. He just looked at her with the expression of someone who is grieving something they didn't know they were about to lose. You need to go home, he said. Tonight, and I need you to know that I will be calling our family attorney in the morning. Every detail in those documents is going to be reviewed, and if they hold up, and I believe they will, we will be filing a report. She looked at him with something that might have been disbelief. You'd really do that to your own sister? He was quiet for a moment. You stole from Mom, he said. You created fake evidence to destroy my marriage. What would you have me do? She had no answer for that. No one in the room did. Her husband put his hand on her arm and said something quietly to her, and slowly, without another word, she picked up her coat from the hook near the door and left. The sound of the front door closing behind her was the only sound in the room for a long moment. Someone eventually said something soft and practical about tea. A few people moved toward the kitchen. The children, who had been kept in the back room during most of what happened, came tumbling out into the hallway asking if there was cake yet, and the sound of them broke something loose in the room, the way only children can. My mother-in-law looked at them and smiled. It was a smaller smile than the one she'd had at the beginning of the night, and it carried something heavier behind it, but it was real. She held out her arms, and the smallest one ran straight into them. My husband came to stand beside me. He slid his arm around my back without saying anything, and I leaned into his shoulder, and, for a moment, neither of us spoke. There was too much to say, and not enough room for any of it yet. That would come later, in the quiet of our own home, over several long and honest conversations that I think made us understand each other better than we ever had before. But for now, we were still in the room, and his mother was still there, and the candles on the birthday cake were still unlit. One of the cousins found a lighter. Someone turned the overhead lights down. We gathered around the table, a smaller circle than we'd started the night with, but real. And when we sang, we meant it. My mother-in-law blew out every single candle. 2 days later, my husband called the family attorney. The account records were submitted for review that same week. My sister-in-law was formally contacted by the attorney the following Monday. The matter was ultimately turned over to local authorities, and as of the time I am sharing this with you, the case is ongoing. Restitution is being pursued, and my mother-in-law has since moved the account into a structure with stronger oversight. I don't tell this story because I want anyone to see my sister-in-law only as the worst version of herself. People do desperate things under pressures that other people cannot always see, and I have tried hard not to let what happened turn me permanently cold toward her. That is not something I carry easily, and I won't pretend it is. But I also know that what she did, the theft, the manipulation, the attempt to destroy my marriage and my reputation in front of every person I had come to call family, those things deserve to be named for what they were. Not dressed up. Not softened into something easier to swallow. What I know is this. The truth has a way of finding its surface eventually. It doesn't matter how carefully someone buries it or how loudly they redirect attention away from it. It finds its way up, and when it does, it changes everything. Not always the way you hope, but always in the direction of clarity. My mother-in-law called me the morning after her birthday. She didn't say much. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was. She said, "I want you to know that I have never once doubted who you are." I told her that meant more to me than I knew how to say. She said she was going to rest, and that she loved me, and she hung up. My husband and I sat on the back porch that night with coffee, and for a long time we just looked at the yard. At one point he said, "You knew. Before the party, you already knew." I told him I hadn't known everything. I told him I had known enough to be ready. He nodded slowly and said, "I should have paid closer attention." I told him it wasn't his fault that someone he loved had chosen to act the way she did. That no amount of paying attention could have made him responsible for her choices. He nodded again. He didn't look entirely convinced, but he reached over and took my hand, and I think that was more important than whatever either of us said. Some nights change a family forever. That night was one of them. Not in the ways we planned when we strung the lights and folded the napkins and wrote out the menu, but in the deeper way, the kind of change that strips away the things that were never solid to begin with and leaves behind only what is real. And what was real, it turned out, was enough.